Mr. Reddy, I
Please.
think my participation is a must here because of the disinformation campaign in a section of Indian media against Russia. And I think they are part of the international disinformation campaign unleashed by the West against Russia. And this campaign became really a fake news factory, and also the Indian public is inundated with fake news and false allegations about Russia, which are coming from the West. And I think that objectivity is needed at the moment, and I will try to make my contribution to tell the Indian public what is the real situation. Well, this conference takes place against the backdrop of events now occurring in Ukraine. And much was said about the origins of this crisis. First and foremost, I want to say this crisis is not about Ukraine. Actually, we are confronting West in this crisis, and Ukraine was just chosen by the West as a pawn in this game. And you know that the unipolar world is very fast and inexorably nearing the end. And this edifice of unipolar world is crumbling. Very evidently it is crumbling, and countries which depended on it, they're trying to cling to this edifice, and I'm sure that in the end they will find themselves under the rubble. Well, and the situation in Ukraine is the end result of a policy that the West has carried out since early 90s. And Russia has its history, its tradition, its own understanding of the history of its peoples, and a vision on how it can ensure its security and as well as interests of the world at large. Well, this became clear in the late 90s and and after the year 2000. The West has repeatedly attempted to stall the independent development of Russia. Of course, this is rather unfortunate. We repeatedly suggested that we should conclude treaties and base our security on equal rights. And we rejected the idea of strengthening one's security at the expense of other countries. The West didn't want equal cooperation, as we can now see, the West has kept true to the testament of notorious Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said that Ukraine should not be allowed to side with Russia. This is a mere exaggeration, but it fits nevertheless the philosophy and the mentality of Western leadership. No effort was spared by it to turn Ukraine into an instrument to contain Russia, into an anti-Russia, as President Putin said. This is not an exaggeration. What has been happening all those years is a significant accumulation of physical, military, ideological, and also philosophical threats to the security of my country. The militarization of Ukraine, which was injected with weapons, including assault weapons, worth many billions of dollars over these years, was also accompanied by the Nazification of all spheres of Ukrainian society and the eradication of the Russian language. You may not be aware of the fact, but after Ukraine got independence, 40% of the population of that country were Russians. And it was not only the language that was being edited out, but simply everything Russian. 3 Ukrainian television channels that were considered disloyal to the current government in Ukraine were shut down. So much for democracy in that country. Neo-Nazi battalions with insignia of Hitler's SS divisions held marches, torchlight processions took place in the capital Ukraine, Kiev, with a presidential regiment assigned as an official escort. Fighters were trained in camp by instructors from the US and other Western countries. And all this was done with the connivance of the so-called civilized Europe and with the open support from the Ukrainian government. So these tendencies accumulated and took on a new form following the coup d'etat in February 2014. Despite the guarantees of the European Union countries, and namely France, Germany, and Poland, that were part of the agreement between the opposition of the then president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, Ukrainian side tore up that agreement the morning after, and those countries also disregarded their own guarantees, humiliated the nations above and the European Union as a whole. This is all very sad, of course. First of all, the new powers that came after the coup d'etat, they demanded that the Ukrainian parliament abolish any privileges granted to the Russian language. And this despite the fact that the Russian language was enshrined in the constitution of Ukraine. The new powers that came after the coup d'etat sent combat battalions and friendship trains to Crimea Peninsula to storm the Supreme Council building. At this point, Crimea rebelled, and Donbass, that area which comprises Lugansk and Donetsk republics, they refused to accept the coup d'etat and then instead asked the new authorities in Ukraine so that could leave them alone. And Donbass did not attack anyone. But Ukrainian authorities declared them terrorists and launched an anti-terrorist operation. That is when it became evident exactly what plans were in store for the future role of Ukraine. The massacre in Donbass was stopped with enormous effort and through Russia's active participation. The Minsk agreements were finally signed. But you, of course, know very well what happened to them next. For 7 long years, Russia tried to appeal to the conscience of those who signed the agreements, and above all to France and Germany. But the end was tragic. Last year and early this year, Kiev began to build up its forces along the line of contact, where they concentrated about 120,000 troops. Contrary to ceasefire agreements that had been signed and violated many times by the Ukrainian side, Ukrainians dramatically increased their heavy shelling and always targeting residential areas. The same has been happening for all these 8 years, with varying degrees of intensity. And amid complete silence from international human rights organizations and the Western, the so-called civilized democracies. Shelling greatly intensified at the start of this year. We received information that Ukraine wanted to implement their Plan B, where they had long threatened to take the regions by force. This was made worse by the West's stonewalling of Russia's initiative to reach an agreement on an equal and indivisible security architecture in Europe. Vladimir Putin put forward this initiative in November 2021, and Russia drafted the necessary documents and relayed them to the US and NATO in December of 2021. The response was that Ukraine and NATO was none of Russia's business. Ukraine was said to have resolved its right to appeal to join NATO. That is why, when Ukraine commenced its shelling, in a clear sign of preparation to launch a military offensive in Donbass, there was no other choice for us left. The choice was to protect the Russian people in Ukraine. We recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And President Putin responded to their request by ordering the launch of a special military operation. I know that you are following these events, and you know that operation has brought to light our worst fears about Ukraine's military plans. And this military operation helped us to derail those ominous plans. And you know, the facts have been uncovered of a dangerous bioweapons program that the Pentagon has been carrying out in many cities of Ukraine. Now that Russia's armed forces have acquired access to these documents, the US has been trying to cover its tracks. The bioweapons research is not limited to Ukraine only and is being conducted in over 300 laboratories in various countries, most of them located in on the territory of the former Soviet Union and nations along the borders of Russia and the People's Republic of China. The unprecedented hysterical reaction in the West to our military operation, the way they are encouraging and indulging everything anti-Russia and anti-Russian, is sad news indeed. I regularly read about the ill treatment that Russian people face in other countries, including citizens of those countries who are of Russian origin. But this all proves one thing, that anti-Russia project has failed and has failed miserably. President Vladimir Putin has listed the goals of this operation, and the first on the list is ensure the safety of the people of the Donbas region. The second one, to eliminate the growing threats to the Russian Federation from the militarization and Nazification of Ukraine. And when the Western powers realize that our policy line has helped to derail their plans, they literally went ballistic. We have always supported diplomatic solution to any problem. Over the course of hostilities, Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, proposed negotiations, and Vladimir Putin agreed. The talks are underway. And even so, there is always a feeling that the Ukrainian delegation is manipulated by the West and most likely by the US, and is not allowed to agree to our demands, which are bare minimum, in my opinion. But the process is underway. We continue to be open to cooperation with any country, including Western ones. However, given how the West has behaved, we are not going to propose any initiatives. Let us see how they will get themselves out of this self-imposed impasse. Many countries are already beginning to rack their brains in search of ways to slowly creep away from the dollar and in international deals. Look what has happened. The United States is sending its diplomats around the world. Its ambassadors in every country have orders to demand that these countries end cooperation with Russia under the threat of imminent sanctions. But when such ultimatums and demands are given to China, India, Egypt, or Turkey, it looks like our American colleagues have totally lost touch with reality. For their superhuman complex has overwhelmed their sense of normalcy. And the situation is very clear. Now they say, getting back to Ukraine, I want to say that the Americans are glowing over the situation, rubbing their hands with glee. In all, 140 countries voted against Russia in the UN General Assembly. We know how these countries reach this decision. US ambassadors have been shuttling from capital to capital and demanded that even the great powers comply with their demands. And they don't shy away from speaking about it in public. But out of these 140 countries voting on US orders, not one imposed any sanctions except the West. It appears that by voting, some of those countries, they wanted to minimize the damage, but they don't want to shoot themselves in the foot, and they will continue to develop their economies. Many independent leaders are saying openly that they don't want to fulfill US instruction to their own detriment. Even if In some cases, they are threatened with bombing into the Stone Age. The West should start minding its own business and stop lecturing others. They told us not to worry about NATO expansion because it does not threaten our security. Why do they get to decide what we need for our security? This is our business, not theirs. We are constantly reminded that NATO is a defensive organization. First, this defensive alliance bombed Yugoslavia. We only recently recalled how in 1998, Joe Biden was so proud that he personally contributed to the decision to bomb Belgrade and breaches over the Drina River. NATO also acted in Iraq without a UN Security Council resolution. In Libya, it didn't have a resolution. It did have a resolution, but only covered establishing a no-fly zone. But what NATO did, it bombed all the army positions from the air and brutally killed Muammar Gaddafi without trial or investigation. And Hillary Clinton went live on the air to celebrate this event. What I want to say here, the situation is, of course, very serious, and looking at this from India, I should say that India carries herself very well in view of the onslaught on it from Western sources. But I would like also to draw parallels with the year 1971. So the same countries which now oppose Russian actions there, same countries oppose Indian actions. They oppose the liberation of Bangladesh. But the truth prevailed. And even they opposed it vehemently, nothing went according to their plan. Bangladesh, free Bangladesh triumph, and Indian position was also, it was proved that Indian position was true. And I want to stress here that if you read the history, world history, and especially the history of Russia, Russia has always been on the right side of history. And we feel that this time we are also there. And all the attempts of the West to annihilate Russia will fail. There is no doubt about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, Mr. Oleg and Avdeev, Consul General of Russia.